Hello. Come on in and sit down. Make yourself at home. This is Discovery Class. I'm Ron. I'm your teacher. This class is coming to you from Brentview Church in Calgary. We're sitting here in our city in the midst of a pandemic, and it's getting worse. We now have no church service. We have no funerals. We have no weddings. I can't go into anyone's home. I can't go into a restaurant. And there are no barbershops open. Some of us have had our vaccine shots. Our kids are out of school. And they're learning from their teacher online at home. In all of this, I find there's something missing. I find that people lack confidence. And they're really looking for guidance. And that's what I want to give you today. We're going to talk about that. No one knows that better than our Lord does. The scripture is loaded with examples of what God did for his people when they had no confidence and they desperately wanted guidance. And then right in the middle of their pandemic, the Bible shows us that God appears. And what he does is rather amazing. As a matter of fact, in some cases, very dramatic. God brings about the flood. He built an ark. And he signaled a brand new beginning. He said, we will never have a flood pandemic ever again. And he said, you have my word. And he placed a rainbow in the sky. The nation of Egypt was subject to the pandemic of plagues. And God said to the Jewish people, I want you to listen, because I'm going to set you free. You're going to begin a brand new journey with me, and I want you to follow the fiery cloud out of Egypt. The children of Israel get to Mount Sinai, and they witness thunder and lightning, and they've suffered from a living society that's without any rules. And then God gives them the 10 Commandments. And the Jewish nation has a brand new journey, and it has road signs on what they can follow. Is your world getting noisy? Mine is. Do you find people are shouting? I can hear them. Do you notice the shocking disregard that people now have for government rules? It seems that the noose is getting tighter, and we're all locked down. Have you noticed that there aren't a lot of acts of kindness out there? There aren't a lot of people with compassion, and I don't see a lot of love. I find a lot of people are not in touch with our God anymore. They don't seem to converse with him at all. And because of that, they don't seem to have any assurance. They hardly have any comfort. And they don't have a lot of wisdom. But I think in the midst of this pandemic, God is about to speak. There's a Jewish celebration that's held every year. It's called Yom Kippur. It's the Day of Atonement. It's the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. And the theme running through that Passover is this: God is with us. Be quiet and still. Let him speak to you. That's what Yom Kippur is really all about. It starts off with a blast from the ram's horn. It's the sound of the great shofar. That's the name of the ram's horn. The beginning of the Yom Kippur is rather strange, because when you go into the synagogue, the leader, who's the rabbi, he puts his hand to his mouth, and everyone has to become quiet. And they have to be very still. And in that, he's telling them, I want you to listen to a still, small voice. I want you to listen. God's going to bring everything that lives before you in review. And he's going to determine life. He's going to determine decree. And he's going to look at the destiny of all his creatures. And when you attend the synagogue and you watch how that all unfolds, suddenly there's a wonderful stillness in that large auditorium. Are you aware that you possess the spark of the divine inside you? It's like a DNA. It's implanted in each of you. And you receive it the moment of your creation. That's said to us in the book of Genesis. There's a still, small voice that resonates in every one of us. And it's in your heart and it's in your soul. And there's nobody left out. You all have it. You don't suppose this pandemic that we're in has given you a moment of silence? Have you had a chance to rediscover your connection that you've had personally with your God? Could it be that in all this confusion of what's happening in our world, God is about to break through and he's going to have a little talk with you? Social isolation is really no fun. However, embedded within these damaging times, I think there's an opportunity for you and me to dwell on those moments of silence and just to listen. In the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 4, the Israelites are commanded to this: hear. I want you to hear, says the old book. Hear. Listen, Israel. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. I want you to hear that. Some of the most transforming moments in life are the ones that you have to listen rather than act. With turbulence and confusion all around us, I want you this morning to find that still, small voice that beats inside you. I'm going to tell you about two preachers this morning who lived in the times past. What did they do about their opportunity when they were locked up? Because both these men were locked up. One lived over 300 years ago, and the other is still living. Now, as an overview, I'm going to call this the tale of two preachers. They both faced a lockdown. They each handled it differently. The scripture says, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name, and him they compelled to bear his cross. I want you to adopt that as your verse today in our lesson. They found a man or a woman of Cyrene. I want you to put your name in there. And I want you to reread it, and it'll sound something like this. They found a man of Cyrene whose name was Ron, and they compelled him to bear the cross. I'll begin by telling you the story of a preacher that lived 3.5 centuries ago. And I'm going to tell you about the plague that he faced. It was a horrible lockdown. And I'm going to tell you how he overcame it. His name was Charles Simeon. His dates are September 24, 1759, and he died November the 13th, 1836. He was 77 years old when he died. He was the youngest of 4 boys. He studied religion and philosophy at King's College, Cambridge, in England. He came from an aristocratic family, meaning he was very wealthy. His dad was very famous. And this young man loved horses, he loved games, and he loved fashion, what he wore. In one of his courses at King's College, he was required to study the Bible. And that became his textbook. He was not familiar with the Bible. He didn't know anything about the Bible because he had never read the Bible. In his studies, he learned that he could transfer all his guilt to another. In other words, he could pass his sin on to someone else who would receive it. He found that God had provided an offering for him, and he could come and take his sins and lay it on the heads, or the head rather, of that offering. Charles Simeon was converted. He became a Christian April the 4th, 1779, Easter Sunday morning. His whole life changed. He didn't follow his studies to become a partner in his wealthy father's business. Instead, he enrolled in the King's College Department of Theology, and he became an Anglican vicar, an Anglican preacher. Now, you may not know it, but all the famous universities in the world, they started out as seminaries. It doesn't matter if it's Yale, Harvard, Princeton, University of Chicago, King's College over in Cambridge. They all started as a seminary to become a preacher. All these other faculties, they were added later, but the original ones all started as a seminary with the Bible as its main textbook. And when they built the seminary, they also built a beautiful chapel. If you want to see some of the finest cathedrals on earth, go to Harvard, go to Yale, go to Princeton, go to the University of Chicago, but go over here to King's College over in Cambridge, and there you're going to be astounded. All the way from the floor to the ceiling are these gorgeous windows, all in stained glass. All the furniture is carved out of oak. They have marble footings all through the building. The most beautiful edifice you've ever seen, and some of them are 300, 400, 500, 600 years old, but they're just as brand new as the day they were made. That was King's College over in Cambridge. Now, Charles Simeon, he went to that seminary at King's College, coming from the east side of Cambridge town, and he walked along a street. And on that street, about 3 or 4 blocks from the college, was a church. It was called Holy Trinity Church. When he walked past that church, for 4 years learning his studies as a preacher, he prayed. He said, Lord, is it possible that you could give me that pulpit for my workbench all the rest of my life? And he knew the Lord wouldn't do that. But the strangest thing happened. When he graduated, after 4 years, what did the Lord do? He gave him that church that he walked past all those 4 years going to study. And at the age of 23, graduated from King's College, ordained into the Anglican Church, and guess what? That church hired him on as their vicar. And you know, he served that church for 53 years. He never got married. He just rolled up his sleeves and away he went to work. But to his dismay, when he got in the church, he found that the Trinity Church was suffering from a horrible lockdown. The church was full of members, just like his father. They were all aristocrats. None of them were Christians. None of them knew the Lord. Charles Simeon was now a believer. They were not. When he started preaching, they didn't want him in that church. His preaching was evangelical. He gave a message that invited people to become a Christian just like he did. He was greatly and quickly alienated. They were in the midst of a liberal plague. And Simon had a vaccine that would cure them, but they didn't want any part of that. Well, what did he do? He had become the object of contempt and the object of derision not only in the church, but among all the wealthy townspeople and all the leaders of all the other Cambridge's universities. Here's what Simeon did. He found a text in the New Testament that caught his eye, and this became his motto to live by all the days that he preached in that church for 53 years. He read the one I read you. They found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear the cross. He said to himself when he heard and read that verse, Lord, my name is Simon. I'm Simeon. I'm your new servant here at Holy Trinity Church. You've compelled me to bear your cross. I'll do it. You can count on me. I'm going to do that for you. Now remember, who's in the congregation? Judges in the court of law, professors, and deans from all the other universities at Cambridge, medical doctors, dentists, veterinaries, members of parliament. None of them are Christians. The church was only a country club. They would show up 3 or 4 times a year, sort of as a fashion statement, and they became part of the old boys club. That's really what Trinity Church was. All the pews in the church were made of oak. But at the end of each one of the benches, there were gates, and the gates were as thick as a refrigerator door. And in that edge of the gate, they had a padlock. And all of those aristocrats that came to Trinity Church, and they only came 3 or 4 times a year, Christmas, New Year's, Easter, Thanksgiving. And when they came, they would bring their key, they would unlock that padlock, open the gate, bring their family, and there they would sit. And it was sort of like going to the Calgary Flames hockey game, and they sort of had a season's ticket. That's what Holy Trinity was. It was locked up to wealthy people that had season's tickets. And the church was virtually in lockdown. If you were Charles Simeon, you've just graduated from seminary just down the street, King's College, what would you do? He felt compelled to bear his cross. The place was locked up. How was he going to bear the Lord's cross with the place locked up? Watch what he did. There were strange events in the town of Cambridge way back 3.5 centuries ago, 350 years ago. One of the events was a public hanging. Little children aged 8, 10 would be led up the gallows to be hung for poaching a pheasant on the lord of the manor's property. Do you know what Charles Simeon did? He went up the gallows with those young boys, and when the rope was placed around their neck and they plunged to their death, he stood right beside them. And after the rope was cut and the little children were sent to the cemetery, he followed them to the cemetery and he gave them a decent burial. And he gave them the committal service. And after the committal service and the dirt was thrown over the children, he would go home and visit the parents. Sunday morning comes around, and guess what? The parents followed Charles Simeon, the man who loved their boy, back to church. Now, they couldn't sit in the pews. I told you they were locked up. There's a padlock on the end of those oak benches. So what did they do? Charles Simeon brought in benches, and he put them up and down all the aisles so the people could sit and listen to him preach. But the wardens of the church, they got wind of that. And on Monday morning, they came in and they took all the benches and they threw them away. So that every Sunday, when they came, if someone came to hear Simeon preach, they had to stand. All the aisles were full. All the naves were full. Everything was full. And none of them jumped over the bench and sat in the pew of those that held the season's ticket. They were very polite. But it must have been strange having to preach from the pulpit and looking at this full church of people in every aisle, all across the back, and all the benches were empty. Can you imagine that? Well, it was locked up. All the aristocrats, they began to hear this and they said, you know what? We better go to church and see whether or not they're jumping over the gate and sitting where I have my season's ticket. So they would come with their key. They would open the gate and they would sit with their families. And gradually the whole church filled. Now, in the overflow, Charles Simeon did the unthinkable. He used to go out before he would preach. And the people had gathered outside on the street and they were all set to come in. And he would say to them, I'm sorry, but our church is full and you won't be able to come in today. However, if you come back tonight at 7 o'clock, I'm going to have an evening service and we're going to do this all over again and I'm going to do it for you. They did. And the church was full. Morning and night. Now, Charles Simeon, I told you, was the youngest of 4 boys. And one of his brothers died. And he left his estate to his brother, Charles Simeon. Do you know what Charles Simeon did with that money? He reached in his pocket and took out all the money he had, and he joined that with his brother's money. And down one side of the church, he built a balcony. And that balcony spread from the front to the back, and there were no benches. It was standing room only. And in the service, it packed. It was full. Do you know how long Charles Simeon had to pastor in the Trinity Church before the padlocks came off the end of the benches? 7 years. He preached his heart out for 7 years before they were able to take the key away from the aristocrats, and the aristocrat would open the gate and let the poor peasant come in and sit beside them. One of the judges who commissioned one of the children to go to the gallows sat next to the parent of that little boy that died. That took 7 years. Charles Simeon won their hearts just simply by loving them. He didn't put down the aristocrats. He didn't tell them to stay and get out. Nor did he beat the drum and said, take those padlocks off. He let them take them off themselves. And then they came in and they sat down. And that became the history. Wednesday nights came along, and Charles Simeon did the strangest thing. He had lay classes for people that were interested in the evangelism and telling Christ the story of how to become a Christian. It was the strangest thing because students came, peasants came, teachers came. It was like an intervarsity class. And they all came and they became part of the teaching. Now remember, in England, during this time, it's a sad day in the history of British history. Britain had all their prisons full. Every prison in Britain was overflowing. And the crime and punishment was very cheap. You got locked out for hardly anything. Well, I told you a little boy would go to the gallows because he poached a pheasant. It got so bad. When there was an empty ship in the Thames River in London, the government filled that ship with convicts from the overflowing prisons, and they shipped them off to Australia. Do you know what Charles Simeon did? Remember, I told you he had a Wednesday night class? He placed one of his Wednesday night students on each boat leaving for Australia. And that little student became the ship's chaplain. He taught his students to preach. Each boat was loaded with prisoners. And each boat became a pulpit for those little students coming out of his class on Wednesday night. Before he died, that is Charles Simeon, it's estimated that 1/3 of all the Anglican preachers in Great Britain had sat under Charles Simeon's teaching. He was also the founder of the British and Foreign Bible Society. Do you know what the spin-off for that was? In Canada, we had a group called the Gideons. Some of you that are listening to me, you got your little New Testament from a Gideon in your class at school. That little Bible that you got is the result of Charles Simeon with the spin-off from what happened over in Great Britain with the British and Foreign Bible Society. Because the Gideons formed theirs exactly the same as Charles Simeon had established it in Britain. In 1981, my two boys, they were 12 and 13 years of age, they had a bicycle route with a newspaper. It was the Calgary Herald. The Calgary Herald is now a morning newspaper, then it was an evening newspaper. Each of my kids had one route, had 60 papers, the other had 70. I said to the boys, I said, I'm going to take you on a holiday, and we're going to go to Great Britain for 5 weeks. Mom's not coming with us, either is little baby Betty. Betty was 7 years younger than Dean. I said, we're going to go. You're going to take your bike. We're going to put it on a Ward Air airplane. We're going to land in Manchester, and we're going to take off out of Gatwick, and we're going to cycle, where Dad did a lot of his studying when he was in his books, reading what went on in Britain. So we did. We took our bicycles, we took a tent, and each boy carried his own sleeping bag. Because I was a farm kid, I'd go to the farmer around 5 at night, and I would say, we're cycling through Britain. Would you give us permission to stay in one of your fields if we help you with your chores? We were never turned down. We set up our tent, we did our laundry in the creek, and we handled up our clothes on a fence the next morning, and away we went. I tell you that because I took those boys to this church, Trinity Church in Cambridge. And when we went, I told them just exactly what I've been telling you. Who was this Charles Simeon? What did he do? Where did he live? How did he live? I took them to the pulpit where he preached. The pulpit's still there. The benches are still there, but padlocks are gone, and so are the gates. And I told them how it all came about. And the balcony is still there all along this side of the Trinity Church. And I said, can't you boys picture them all full and all of this full? And they did. Now I said, I want you to get your bike. We're going to ride down the street to the King's College Chapel. And I want to show you one more thing. When we went into the chapel, and that's a gorgeous chapel. Class, if you don't understand what the chapel is like, I want you to Google King's College singers. And it'll come up and it'll show you the Christmas carols that are sung in that beautiful chapel every year by these beautiful young male singers. And it's gorgeous because you're going to see from the floor to the ceiling this gorgeous chapel with stained glass. Anyway, I took my boys in the main gate, and as we went into the chapel, I said, boys, take a look at the floor. Do you see that big marble slab? I want you to notice that as you keep it, that there's a little letter on it. It says CS. Now, can you give me the dates? One of them read them back to me. 1759, 1836. I said to them, do you know what that is? No. I said, that's Charles Simeon's tomb. That's where Charles Simeon is buried. 53 years he served that church. He was never married. Single man all his life. Died at the age of 77. He took his church through one of the worst plagues, the lockup. They had locked the gospel up. Christ had been sent out. There was no Holy Spirit. Nobody understood what the Bible meant. You couldn't live as a Christian because they didn't know what a Christian was. He taught them how to unlock not only the gates on the end of their bench, but also their minds. He was able to tell them the story of the cross. Now, I told you there's another preacher. that I wanted you to meet. He's still living. He had a terrible hardship in his life. He didn't have lockup in his church of a bench with padlocks. For the last 20-some years of his life, his wife came down with dementia. Her name was Martha. They had 2 children. They had a boy and a girl. The boy's name was Paul. The girl's name was Jeannie. Martha was a very gifted speaker, his wife. She had spoken to conferences, hundreds and hundreds of ladies in attendance. Bob was just as good a preacher. Very gifted. Now, during the time that I was chaplain here at Brentview, in the mid-70s, I was the moderator of the Alberta Baptist Association. The association was made up of 40 or 50 churches all over our province, and once a year, each church would send delegates to a conference held in one of the cities. Bob Wilson, I had invited to become our guest conference speaker. It was at Medicine Hat. I picked Bob up at the airport in Calgary, and we went down together, and we roomed together in one of the motels. And the conference was outstanding. We began with an opening banquet. We ended with a closing morning breakfast. Bob was the speaker 4 or 5 times. And then we went home. My job was to take Bob home on Thursday so that he could catch a plane back to London so that he could preach in the great church of Wortley Baptist Church in downtown London, Ontario. Now, Bob and I got in the car after he'd finished his lecture at the breakfast, and off we went. We were coming down the Trans-Canada Highway, heading from Medicine Hat to Calgary. We hadn't gone 1 hour when suddenly in the middle of the road, there was a road blockage. And guess what it was? They had a winter-spring storm right in the middle of April, just like now. And the road was closed. And they said it's going to be closed for a day or 2 days. And we had to turn around and go back. Bob looked at me and he said, almost in panic, "Ron, I'm not going to get home. I have to get home. I haven't got anyone to preach for me." We both just sat there. I didn't have anything to say. I could just feel his disappointment. After a few minutes, I turned the car around and I started back towards Medicine Hat. And when I came to the first side road, I turned right and went south. And Bob said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to go and find something for you, Bob." Now, about 2 or 3 miles below the Trans-Canada Highway was another parallel highway, but it was the train. It was the Via Rail, that train that ran between Toronto and Vancouver, and it ran right parallel to the Trans-Canada Highway. When we got to the crossover, and it was only a couple of miles south of the main highway, there they had these big gates that go down and back with red lights. When the train went by, I pulled into a little siding just off to the side, parallel to the track. And Bob said, "What are you doing?" I didn't answer him, but I left my car running and I put my lights on bright on the car and I had the flashers going, just like this. And then I got out of the car and I said, "Bob, you stay there, keep your suitcase and watch me." I walked down the track heading towards Medicine Hat on the track. I was hoping a train would come. I was going to stop the train. Now, don't any of you ever do this. And sure enough, coming ahead of me, way down the track, was a bright light. And I thought, here comes a train. Now, I thought it could either be the Via Rail, which was the passenger train, doesn't go anymore. It was coming from Medicine Hat, no stops between Medicine Hat and Calgary, because there's no place to stop. There are no towns, really, little ones. And then the next thing, maybe there was a freight train. And if there's a freight train coming and they would stop, I could put Bob on the caboose, because all the trains in those days had a caboose on the back, and that's where the conductor was. As I got closer, and this train light got closer, I thought, Lord, please let that man blow that horn. Do you know he did? And I heard the most amazing blast. And he didn't let up. It just kept blasting. And the more he blasted, the more I did this. And I tried to stop the train. Class, it worked. That train, I could sense was slowing down. And I could hear the wheels squealing. And it happened to be the passenger train. And it came right beside me, and it crossed over our gravel road, and the arms had come down, and there it stopped, and out stepped the conductor. "What's going on?" I said, "I have a man who has to get to Calgary," and I lied. I said, "He's a doctor, and he has to get there immediately, and they've closed the highway because of a storm up ahead. You're going to face it, but it won't bother you." I put some money into the conductor's hand, and I said, "Bob, take your suitcase and follow the man on board." He did. And I said to Bob as he left, I said, "Bob, don't tell him who I am." And I don't think he did. A couple of days later, when I got home, there came in the mail a nice letter. And it was from Bob. And it had a very nice salutation. And then it said this: "Ron, poor is the pupil who does not surpass his teacher." Those are the words of Michelangelo. Bob was my professor in New Testament in the days when I was at seminary. And he said to me, rather flatteringly, "Ron, poor is the pupil who does not surpass his teacher. Thank you for stopping the train. Thank you for getting me home on time. Thank you for the wonderful experience I had in Medicine Hat." Now I want you to advance that clock ahead slowly. Many years have passed now. Bob is still the pastor there at Wortley Baptist Church. His wife Martha is 53 years old. She is now suffering onset dementia. Bob looked after Martha for 20 years. He watched her separate from the mind, and he had almost total care for the first 10 years. And then he couldn't do anymore, and she had to be institutionalized. And you know what Bob did? Now, you talk about unlocking something that has been locked up. What he unlocked was his love for his wife. Do you know what he did? He spent 20 years of his life as a pastor there at Wortley looking after Martha. In the first 10 years, she would come and sit in the front row, and there he'd place her while he preached and did the service. And then she couldn't come anymore. She was institutionalized and bedridden, and Bob went to her side every day for 10 years and fed her. He fed her a hot meal every noon, all the days of her life. And I said to Bob, after she died and Bob did the service, I said, "Bob, why did you do that? She didn't know who you were." Do you know what he said? He said, "Ron, I loved her with all my heart. And if I had been where she was, she would have done the same thing for me. And I did that because that was not a heavy cross to carry. I bore that for her." Do you know, all of us, as I close class, you've got someone in your family or a neighbor, and they're suffering, maybe not from that, but something worse. We're all locked up. What are you giving those people? I want you to give them the greatest love that they could ever receive. Tell them who you are. Tell them why you're loving them. Tell them why Charles Simeon loved his congregation so much that the padlocks come off. Bob saw the padlock come off Martha's mind just by the love that he shared with her by the feeding. Yesterday was Mother's Day. We got snow in Calgary, Mother's Day. We couldn't leave the house, but I took Mary, my wife, on a little trip, just a treat. We went through McDonald's. I got a coffee, she got a latte. We have a cemetery in our town, way up on the top of a hill. We drove up there, and in the midst of the cemetery, with the snow coming down and 4 inches of white, there we looked at the tombstones. Just recently, there was a funeral up there. One of our ladies, like Martha, had died in extended care with a husband that fed her every day for years. His name is Dan Nemus. Her name is Gloria. Gloria is laid to rest up there. I went up there on Mother's Day watching the snow come down, and I wanted that to come because it was almost as if there were white tears from heaven flowing down and showing me a man's love. I'll never forget that. Who would have ever thought Mother's Day in May in Calgary, 4 inches of snow at a cemetery? Who'd take any joy in that? Well, I did, because I knew that we had laid to rest one of Brentview's giants. And Dan, if you're listening, thank you. You gave me an example that I'll never forget. And you gave our church an example that we're all going to follow. Well, that's enough today. I'd like to close my class with a smile from the sunny side of the street. 2 little boys. Their names were Tom and Danny. They're always getting into trouble. And their mom knows their mischief. And in that little town, everybody heard of the mischief they were getting in. And the boy's mother heard that there was a preacher in town who had been successful in disciplining the children. She asked if she could speak, or if he would speak with the boys. Preacher agreed. But he said, I'm going to talk to them one by one. You bring one in the morning, and I'll bring the other one in the afternoon. So the little boy, he came in first. The preacher, a huge man with a deep booming voice. He sat the young boy down, and he asked him sternly, do you know where God is, son? The boy's mouth dropped open, and he didn't say anything. He just shook his head. The preacher repeated the question, where is God? Well, again, the boy made no attempt to answer. And then, almost in desperation, pointing the finger in the boy's face, he yelled and bellowed, where is God? The boy screamed, and he bolted out of the room. He ran home as fast as he could go up the stairs, and he hid himself in the closet. His older brother came in, and he found him in there, the door shut. And he said, what happened? The younger brother, gasping, he said, you and I are in big trouble. We are? Oh, yeah. Why? The little guy said, God's missing. And they think we did it. See you next week. Thanks for coming by, class.